I'd like to welcome everyone back from the morning session and extend a special welcome to the people who are just joining us now for the opening keynote of the Climate in Crisis conference. My name, for those of you who don't know me or who missed the morning session, is Dr. Erica Basumic, and I am a historian of the US West, Native American and environmental history, and one of the co-conveners along with Dr. Megan Raby of the Climate in Context conference. This conference is a culmination of year-long theme on the same topic. And you can see recordings of all the previous sessions on Not Even Past, and we'll post a link to that in the chat in case you're interested in going back and seeing some of those other events. Just a little bit on the structure of today's event. Dr. Demuth will speak, and then we'll have a question and answer period afterwards. If you want to add a question through the Q&A feature of Zoom, you can do so while she's speaking, or you can just raise your hand. That indicates you would like to ask her a question live. We'll just make you able to speak at the end when we're in the Q&A period. So just using that little raise your hand feature is how we'll do that. So when Dr. Raby and I started to plan this event and began consulting our colleagues about who was doing new and cutting edge research and work in the fields of climate and environmental history, one name kept coming up, Bathsheba Demuth. Since Megan and I had already discussed how much we admire her work as a writer and teacher on numerous occasions, we were thrilled to hear others express the same enthusiasm for her work. We were delighted when she agreed to join us for this conference to give the opening keynote. Dr. Demuth is an assistant professor of history and environment and society at Brown University. She received her PhD from UC Berkeley in 2016, and her first book, Floating Coast: An Environmental History of the Bering Strait, was published in 2019. It promptly won 6 prizes and received honorable mentions from 3 other organizations. And these organizations range from the Western History Organization to the Pushkin House. And just by me naming those 2, you get an idea or a sense of just how wide-ranging the appreciation for her work is and how broad the topic is in many ways. It's been praised repeatedly. Her book has been praised repeatedly for both its ecological precision and its ethnographical detail. My colleague, Dr. Joan Neuberger, who is a Russian historian, recently wrote an eloquent profile of Dr. Demuth on Not Even Past, discussing the reach of her work, and I want to briefly quote from it here. Dr. Neuberger writes, "I was impressed with the quality and reach of Demuth's writing. She not only described the history and stakes of environmental calamity in the far north, but she did so in unusual ways, bringing us closer than I imagined possible to the experiences of the creatures with whom we share our worlds. As someone who has been writing about animism and immersion in nature, I couldn't wait to read her book, and I wasn't alone." Dr. Neuberger is clearly not alone in appreciating Dr. Demuth's work, and we are thrilled to introduce her to give the opening keynote in our conference today, titled "The Reindeer and the End of the World: Apocalypse, Climate, and Soviet Dreams." Please join us in welcoming Dr. Demuth.
Thank you so much, Erica, and thank you also to Megan and to Courtney for organizing this conference, and Courtney for really your unbelievable behind-the-scenes organization. It's always so comforting as somebody who's presenting at one of these to have the sense of real comfort with just how things are going to unfold, and I have had that sense from the beginning. I'm going to do the thing that we all have to do these days, which is lean over awkwardly and share my screen. All right, there it is. I would also like to really thank and commend the graduate student presenters this morning for starting this conversation for the conference this week off on such a wonderful note. I learned a great deal, and I'm really excited to see where their projects go from here. And it's my honor, truly, to join you in this keynote from where I live in Rhode Island on unceded Narragansett and Wampanoag lands, coming to you, as I realize, all over the country and indeed all over the world. I want to start with a little bit of a disclaimer this afternoon. I am not a historian of climate in any kind of traditional sense. What I am is a historian who passes any time that I can in a climate that looks, if you have the kind of habits of mind of a temperate part of the world, quite extreme. I spend a lot of time in the Arctic and subarctic. And this is also a part of the world where you do not need to visit an archive in order to see climate change. The poles of the Earth are warming at about twice the rate of temperate regions, making the Arctic climate anomalies of the present premonition of what temperate zones will experience in the future. What I want to do today is visit some of the pasts of one of these northern places, the Chukchi Peninsula, which on this map is on the left-hand side there in what is now Russia. To give you a sense of where it is in Russia, this peninsula is closer to Boston than it is to Moscow. So it's very, very far to the northeast. And about 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, I was traveling north on a road in Chukotka to visit some of the reindeer brigades who live in the interior. I was heading toward the dot that on this map is on labeled Amguema, and running roughly alongside the Omvam River, which on some maps is called the Amguema River. The Omvam is the Chukchi name. I was traveling with a young Chukchi man named Alex, who had relatives who live along the Omvam River, and we were bringing them gifts for an upcoming celebration. So we were traveling with boxes of biscuits and sugar and tea, and evaporated milk and butter and those sorts of things. And one of the strange parts of being a historian, and maybe particularly an environmental historian, is that you often come to places and landscapes that you already know in some form from the archives or other kinds of documentary evidence. I had never visited this part of Chukotka before physically, but I had walked there the way that many of us in our profession do in the company of the dead. And what those dead had told me about this part of the peninsula was to pack warm. In a Vladivostok archive several years before, I had read that in August, snow squalls and whipping cold and wind were not unusual. In Moscow archives, I had read about ice on the water starting in September. But there I was in 2018, not even in a sweater. This part of the Arctic was the hottest summer on record in 2018, although that record has been bested since then. All through that June and July, people would say in an offhand way, or with worry, or with a kind of gallows humor, that they were experiencing the end of the world or living through Armageddon. And these conversations were part of a much larger trend. The first word of what I think is still the most widely read climate change article to date by David Wallace Wells is doomsday. Scholars working on theories of societal collapse, from Joseph Tainter to Peter Turchin to Jared Diamond, have offered grim, highly reported, very popular takes on the general state of the world. Even the tenor of much traditional climate history, with real exceptions for work by Dagmar de Groot and some others, give a very dubious view of past social responses to perturbations in the climate. Which is grim news, particularly given that just a few weeks after I returned from Russia, scientists at the IPCC gave the world 12 years to reduce carbon emissions or risk warming that was so great it was frequently headlined as being a climate apocalypse. That number of years is now down to 9. The foreboding is so intense, and climate change has become the background and provided kind of a moral dread to fiction, from Jenny Offal's novel Weather to Christine Smallwood's academic satire Life of the Mind, both of which pit the daily life of their heroines against the looming shadow of climate catastrophe. Thus, the narrative mode of apocalypse is very present for people speaking about the far north in particular, but also for the human future in general. We are constantly given these prophecies of rupture. Being trained as a historian, however, makes it hard to see these stories as neutral. They shape the borders of our minds and of our politics. So I spent much of that trip to Chukotka wondering, what is the attraction of these narratives of absolute end? And what are the meanings that slink in with a proclamation of apocalypse? What I want to do in our time together this afternoon is recount bits of the trip that I took up toward Amguema and through the pasts that we encountered on that road, from Chukchi theories of history to Bolshevik aspirations for the future. Both of these speak to what apocalyptic narratives, the allure of the ending world, can bring, and also what they foreclose, the experiences of surviving actual worlds ending. This is a historical exploration, but also one, like some of the panelists we heard this morning, that takes seriously, or in my case, is a bit obsessed by thinking about how the tools and modes that history bring to our thinking can help us think about our present. One of the dead in whose company I have passed some days is a man named Karl Lux. He was, if this picture is any guide, dark-haired and quite handsome when he wrote the following from Chukotka to Moscow in the 1920s. Quote, "The Chukchi are the majority of the native population of the Chukchi Peninsula. Under the Tsars, these natives were only of interest as suppliers of furs. Nobody gave a thought to protecting the base of the native economy, to improving his way of life. As a result, the fur trade was nearly extinguished and reindeer husbandry fell off catastrophically. To fix this destruction is our task." End quote. Karl's life contains a history of apocalyptic allure, of what sings to us from beyond the horizon of a demolished now. He was born on the western edge of the Russian Empire in 1888 to a peasant family so destitute that his father nearly sold an infant Karl to the childless baron who owned the lands his parents worked. As a boy, he tended cattle. Around him, most people were confined to agricultural toil on old noble estates or industrial toil in new factories. His parents were unable to afford education beyond basic literacy, so Karl became a deckhand when he was hardly more than a child. His voyages took him through Baltic ports that thrummed with discontent. Strikers protested factories that rent their bodies. Bread lines turned into riots after days of hunger. Students across Russia demanded representative government. Tsar Nicholas II, heir to 4 centuries of autocratic rule, sheltered in his palaces, spent lavishly, and hired more police. The people that Karl met outside those aristocratic walls found their present to be so unjust, so sickly, and so impossible. Their question was not, would it end, but how and when? Karl heard Baptists preaching hellfire, Orthodox priests invoking the salvation of saints, and other sects calling down the final judgment. These visions, in a general sense, share a plot. First, there is the apocalypse, then a reign of harmony and perfection. It's a very old story, passed from the Middle East to Europe, from Jewish cosmologies into Christian traditions, going back almost 3,000 years to the prophecies of Zoroaster, who foretold a cataclysmic battle between light and dark. The triumph of the light would give the righteous a new life, one without suffering or toil, and also one in which the cycles of birth and death would end. The world would become a linear and immortal place. Karl did not become a Baptist or worship saints. He joined a socialist reading circle. In Yuri Sloskin's masterful reading of the Russian socialist condition, the plot that Karl learned also came from Zoroaster's lineage. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels foretold how the darkness of capitalist exploitation would become the light of communist utopia. Between these poles was a kind of earthly revelation, what socialists called revolution. A word that Sloskin reminds us promises the end of the old world and the beginning of a new just one. I first met Karl in an age-crumpled file in Vladivostok, where I learned what he would give for this new world. At 17, he was arrested for distributing illegal pamphlets. For the next decade, he was in and out of custody. He left a 4-year term in Oriel Central Penitentiary, which is the building at the bottom of the screen here, with tuberculosis. In his autobiography, he described another imprisonment where he was bound by a guard, where, quote, "the ropes ate into my body to the bones at the hands and feet, which were so swollen and blackened, it was impossible to control them." When Vladimir Lenin brought the revolution to Russia in the bitterly cold and hunger-filled winter of 1917, Karl was in Siberian exile. He joined Lenin's army when it reached the north and then moved to Chukotka. He was tasked by the new Soviet government with liquidating the consequences of century-old historical injustices from the tundra. So when Karl wrote, "To fix this destruction is our task," part of what he meant was, "We shall end the unjust world, and beyond it is a life without want." I find much to admire in the purity of this vision. Karl went to prison and into exile to help found the kingdom of freedom on earth. It also shows an appeal of a kind of apocalyptic thinking that drove Karl. One appeal of the apocalypse is that it can make those on its threshold feel world historically important. So what is this place called Chukotka that Karl went to save and I traveled through in 2018? The interior of Chukotka is reindeer country, and it has been since at least the end of the last ice age. Reindeer are animals that are almost never alone and almost never still. They move constantly to find fresh pasture and to find breezes that will keep mosquitoes from tormenting their flesh. And as I've learned from some time spent with them, they make a gently percussive sound when they travel in herds like this one, as there's a tendon in their hooves that snaps over the semisoid bone. Chukotka is also Chukchi country. It has been, in Chukchi history, back into very deep time. And in that far-reaching past, reindeer have always been important to people. But there are also animals with a changing and dynamic relationship with the Chukchi. Centuries before the first Russian speaker came here, the Chukchi and wild reindeer struck a bargain in the relationship that we call domestication. Reindeer, who lived as familiars with people, were protected from wolves and bears. People who lived as familiars with reindeer were protected from hunger. In the history that Chukchi tell of themselves, a few dozen domesticated reindeer made food and shelter newly dependable. Hundreds or thousands of domestic reindeer made politics newly potent, as the bodies of many reindeer, these large herds, carried the authority of gifts and of armies fed for war. In the 1700s, Chukchi fought and won battles against the Russian Empire, expelling them to the edges of Chukchi territory where they were allowed to trade, usually on Chukchi terms. Yet, to walk out with a herd of reindeer on a tundra morning was also to enter a world where human authority did not extend fully even to the tame animals snuffling outside Chukchi tents. Chukotka's hills were home to many beings, to mushroom-shaped men and giants with gaping mouths, and wild reindeer people, any of which could steal away a herd. Some of these beings were kin, and some were foes. The valleys, rivers, the reindeer, the foxes, the walruses, all were beings with souls that required entreaty. To live in Chukotka required supplication and a frank acknowledgement of dependence on beings other than humans. That is, social life was made up of persons, but not all persons were human. Many were reindeer. Chukchi theories of history took from this a sense that time contained a linear aspect, the domestication of reindeer, for example, but was caught too in patterns of change that spooled out through the land in cycles. The Chukchi were keen observers of a pattern of time in the Arctic that is also resonant in scientific work on the northern climate and species. Since the end of the last ice age, the far north has seen cyclical changes in climate that, to simplify it enormously, mean each century or 50 years, there's a spate of relatively warm summers and winters, often about between 1/2 and 1/4 degrees Celsius warmer than the average. For reindeer, these series of warm years meant intertwined peril. Cold air reduces precipitation, so when there's a warm winter, the snows are deeper and herds founder in the drifts. Often in these warmer winters, rain will fall on the surface of the snow and then freeze again, creating a layer of ice that make it very difficult or impossible for reindeer to paw through to reach the lichen and dried grasses beneath. In the summer, warm weather means bogs infected their hooves that hindered migration and also left them vulnerable to outbreaks of anthrax. For the Chukchi observing these patterns, the Arctic climate worked through their reindeer to influence both life and politics. A family with 5,000 reindeer could, in a decade, find themselves with only hundreds, enough for food, but not for armies. There were no hereditary leaders as a result in Chukchi life, or fixed hierarchies. Such things were laughable. To walk out on an Arctic morning was always to appeal to a will-filled universe. For, as one Chukchi man told it not long after Karl Lux was born, nothing created by man has any power. Karl, either Karl Lux or Karl Marx, would not have agreed. Freedom, as Friedrich Engels wrote, consists in the control over ourselves and over external nature. Liberation came from bending every resource to human need, and only humans could be free. It was the fundamental plot for Marx and for Engels, this capacity for progress that drew societies from hunting and gathering to agriculture, and from agricultural to industrial capitalism that would go onward toward revolution, beyond which there would be no suffering or decay. The idea of time that Karl Lux brought with him to Chukotka was aggressively linear. On the tundra, Karl's task was to identify external nature to control. Chukotka was too cold for traditional agriculture and too distant and rugged for much industry, but there were reindeer with useful meat and foxes with valuable pelts, and there were people who, in the Bolshevik view, like shared by Karl, needed saving from the boot heel of natural caprice. Young missionaries of the new culture and the new Soviet state, as one Bolshevik put it, came north, like this young teacher in the photo, to teach the Chukchi about Lenin. Or, in the case of the carving that's at the bottom of your screen, to create images in which Lenin himself came to Chukotka and hung out, as he was wont to do, on a stuffed sealskin, explaining the world to come. Other new Bolshevik arrivals designed methods of reindeer corralling and pasturing, and systems for making fox pens and barns. The goal of both interventions was to eradicate flux in reindeer and fox numbers. Out on the tundra, fox populations rose and fell every few years, dependent on cycles of lemmings. Socialist farms would replace such inconsistency with predictable growth. Caged foxes required no long days setting traps either among the thickets where foxes tend to prowl. Instead, Chukchi could live in town, in apartments with electricity and running water, while their children, as Karl wrote, could attend a first-class school, not in the native dialect, for a real Soviet education. Karl did not ask the Chukchi if they wanted this new world. No one did, nor did anyone ask the foxes about the pens or the reindeer about the corrals. To do so was not thinkable. Another appeal of the apocalypse, proclaiming it, is not an act of supplication, but of certainty. In Chukotka, such certainty can seem like a kind of madness. And Karl Lux did not live to see most of it. In 1932, he took an accidental bullet while surveying foxes and reindeer and other life on the Chaun River in Chukotka's northwest. As he bled to death, so the Soviet reports go, he begged his fellow revolutionaries to continue their work in, quote, the most remote places inhabited by the natives, no matter the victims, and in spite of any cost. On that summer day in 2018, as we traveled north toward the Omvam River, Alex told me how many of the victims who came after Karl were Chukchi. We did not want to live in the way that the Soviets said was correct, Alex explained. All around us as we drove were ruins of Karl's world. The way of life that these structures built into the land, settled, electrified, educated in Russian, did not signal the promised land to Alex's ancestors as it had for Karl. The Chukchi did not want to give up their nomadic reindeer herding to Soviet farms or to take day-long shifts in dark fox barns, or give over their visions of creation, the raven that made their land long ago, or the boy that was born from a reindeer's ear for the stories that Bolsheviks told. Bouncing north towards the Omvam River, I thought about the Bolshevik teacher whose memoir I had read a couple of years before. There was a moment when he pointed to a portrait of Lenin in discussion with a Chukchi elder, and the Bolshevik teacher explained how, quote, he that we see hanging on the wall taught that all people will live well only when they themselves make their own lives by learning to read. The Chukchi elder he was speaking with responded, what you say is nonsense. Doesn't Lenin know we make our own lives ourselves? And after all, the Chukchi, who began domesticating reindeer hundreds of years before the Soviets arrived, knew the power of their animals. They knew that reindeer had granted them autonomy from the Russian Empire and allowed individuals to amass wealth in herds of thousands, even if that wealth was temporary. As a result, they greeted many of the Soviet results with open skepticism in the 1920s and early 1930s. The Chukchi received me warmly and willingly talked about general abstract themes and topics that did not directly concern their livestock, one young Soviet wrote. But when issues began to touch on the deer and reindeer herding, the Chukchi became wary and stopped talking. In the 2 decades after Karl died, the different understanding of what a reindeer should be and who should own them created simmering violence across the tundra. The Chukchi killed their reindeer or killed themselves rather than be part of the new promised land. And sometimes there were open small wars, histories of violence that ran across the tundra, leaving no obvious mark on the physical landscape, but histories that were right under the surface of any conversation. Around and after this violence, Soviet scientists mapped those hills and rivers. And you might see in their efforts echoes of some of this morning's discussion of trying to simplify landscapes for plantations, although here the goal was less a plantation than a sort of rationalized migration, because reindeer cannot be penned permanently. As a result, scientists studied tundra plants for methods of rational use. They vaccinated reindeer, dusted them with DDT, and bred them deliberately for size and temperament. The Soviet archives are dense with studies on the use of reindeer milk, sinew, and hides. Reindeer herding was also mechanized as much as possible, given over not to the reindeer work that Chukchi had traditionally used to haul sleds and tents, but to fossil fuel-powered machinery wherever possible. Wolves were hunted from helicopters and poisoned by the hundreds. The purpose of these interventions, was the creation of more reindeer, since more reindeer were a sign of the arrival of Karl Lux's dream, a perfect linear history and increased productivity on the tundra. On that tundra, Chukchi were still in regular relation with the reindeer. They were the majority of the herders doing the day-to-day work of caring for the herds. But husbandry now required formal education, and education was found in towns. Herding brigades lived in apartment blocks in clusters of small villages, usually along the coast, and took week or month-long shifts on the tundra, flown out to their reindeer by helicopter, and then sleeping in huts dragged behind the herds by tractors. And they reported to a central farming dispatch manager by radio. In town, women were left to look after foxes in the growing number of fox barns. Both reindeer and fox work had become as much like factory work as is possible. And like Soviet factory work anywhere, there were problems. Tractors took years to arrive so far north. People drank too much and read too little, at least according to Soviet reports. But the correct socialist form of animal management was in place, a way of organizing reindeer and fox lives for the good of the Soviet Union and for the creation of, quote, first-rank workers of the tundra, people of a new type who unflinchingly and every year achieve high indices in the field of reindeer breeding. One reindeer scientist even went so far as to argue that the socialist revolution had brought such new forms of organizing the reindeer herd that growth would be infinite. The ultimate linear dream of progress unending, an escape from the limits of moss and lichen and from the necessity of relating to other life. It is an irony at the heart of the Marxist project, or at least the Soviet variant of it, that in the attempt to free human beings from exploitation, all other forms of life became a mere resource. It also says something else about apocalyptic visions. In the apocalyptic battle, the only damned or saved are human. In this story, our species has no kin but ourselves. We reached the Omvam River by midday on that trip in 2018. A quarter of a mile from the banks of the Omvam is the village of Amguema. It is a Soviet town with concrete buildings connected by elevated gas pipes still shedding insulation. Entropy has taken over on the outskirts, pulling down houses, filling the space between with fireweed. But in the center, there are curtains and open windows and bright paint on the concrete. We stopped to speak with a group of men, spattered in mud, wearing rubber boots, digging a hole. One of them introduced himself as the mayor. They were digging a drainage ditch, he explained. The tundra under the town had started to seep. Alex asked if the reindeer brigades were close, and the mayor pointed us west toward the river. If they have returned, he said, their yaranga, their reindeer hide tents, will be there. He advised us that we walk. Since the fall, he said, the roads have decayed. In Chukotka, when somebody mentions the fall, what they mean is the collapse of the Soviet Union. By then, in the early 1990s, socialist efforts to control this land had changed many things, built roads and apartments, brought children into schools, herded reindeer with helicopters and snow machines. Chukotka became a Soviet version of the world that we now find normal, where lights come on with a switch and ships bring goods from far away. But the Soviet Union never did quite mold time on the tundra into linear form. Even before the USSR sundered, reindeer herds defied Soviet prophecy and declined due to a series of warming years in the climate. Foxes, even in their pens, kept dying of rabies and distemper. Karl's most apocalyptic promise, the freedom from any natural constraint, proved impossible. And then what had changed disappeared. In my profession, the question of the Soviet collapse is often one of why. Was it the economy? Was it the politics? Was it ideology? But in Chukotka, when people tell stories of the 1990s, they usually talk about how. How did we survive a civilization in its ending? All that the Soviets had brought with them, the gas heat, and the bakeries, the machinery, and the medicines was no more. Alex was a child when the electricity stuttered off. There was no longer gasoline to move supplies along the roads, but there were also no supplies to move anyway. For a decade, the region experienced a kind of crash decarbonization, the withdrawal of almost all fossil fuel power. It is not a particularly good model of how to decarbonize. Older people died without medicine or warmth. Mothers worried that lack of food meant little milk for their infants. Everything was cold. People described the horizon of time closing. What would the summer bring that would keep families and whole towns alive during winter? What would the winter bring? The fox barns emptied, and untended reindeer went feral or were lost to wolves. Yet each day also came with the small, specific tasks of survival. Chukchi families set up yaranga inside their apartments and burned seal oil lamps for warmth and light. Through summer and fall, people picked berries and greens and packed them in seal fat for winter. It was good to know hunters who lived along the coast, in the villages where elders still remembered how to kill bowhead whales without specialized equipment. It was also good to know how to tend reindeer without helicopters, to sew reindeer hide boots, to make harnesses, and harness a reindeer when the snow machines ran out of fuel. Much of what kept people alive were small things, things easily overlooked or dismissed by some historians as mere chores, the women's work of caring. But regardless of gender, solidarity, that old socialist refrain, ceased to be a slogan and became a daily necessity. At the end of the world, there are no damned and saved souls, only people and other kin to share in the work of making life possible. None of us knew what would happen, Alex told me. We couldn't just hope it would end. The trick to surviving was in knowing something about the land and the animals, and in keeping on without any certainty. When we finally arrived to the Omvan River's banks, the reindeer were still out at pasture. None were to be seen as we picked our way over the uneven ground with the bags of bread and biscuits. On the bank, among the low willows, there were two of these round tents that you see in the corner here, the yaranga, round and white like landed clouds, and each one had a guard dog outside, very happy, waist high, like a small bear, and which barked. And from within the tent, someone called out hello and asked if we wanted tea. Stooping into the yaranga, I meet two older Chukchi people, Grigori and Anna, sitting near the coals of the fire. We give them our names and sat cross-legged on reindeer skins, passing over our gifts in exchange for tea. The conversation looped then between Russian and Chukchi, so I did not understand all of it. There were relatives to be discussed, and then news from wider Russia to pass on. What was Putin doing in Moscow? What was happening in Vladivostok? I did catch that Grigori and Anna were born just after the Chukchi and the Soviets ceased killing each other, and were nearly grandparents by the collapse. Their sons work in Amguema for part of the year, but were out with the reindeer for the summer. They would sell some of the meat in Chukotka's larger towns and keep the rest, along with the skins, for their relatives, and bundle up the reindeer antlers to sell south to China. The tundra where the reindeer were grazing had grown strange, Grigori explained. There were new insects, beetles that the Chukchi have no words for, and which were eating some of the same plants that reindeer eat. Anna was worried about chemicals and cancer, from what the Soviets left behind, the military wreckage and the other debris, but also from the garbage that she said washed up on the Bering Sea coast after every storm. What does it leach into the fish we all eat from this river, she asked. And then there was the weather. There had been several years of deep snow, of rains that came late into the fall. We all looked down at our tea. No one knows what's going to happen, Grigori said. It's probably a good idea to buy more rubber boots. On that afternoon along the Omvam River, I was almost the same age as Karl Lux when he wrote, "To fix this destruction is our task." We had other things in common. I also came of age, or I am of age, in a world too precarious and unjust to continue with impunity. People with power spend lavishly and hire more police. In the United States, our national politics leads less to the poor selling their children to the wealthy than the wealthy stealing children's futures, carbon atom by carbon atom. All around are whispers of the end. We live in late capitalism, people say, implying imminent sundown. We live in the sixth extinction, people say, calling up the void with the phrase. We live in a climate emergency, a crisis, a thing terribly more than change. The grimmest of these prophecies tells an old story, the ultimate battle in which an unlivable climate will drive out the darkness that we have become, as if the end to human failing is our own extinction. The core of such apocalyptic thinking is nihilism. This world is too despoiled to continue. The seduction of such stories is in how certain they make the teller feel. An apocalyptic narrative is like looking at a horizon with no clouds or hills. The way forward is terribly assured. To walk it, there is no need to mind the lives of others, rendered invisible by the power of imagining they are already gone. Apocalyptic prophecy is also an escape from contemplating and from seeing in the here and now how life goes on even through catastrophe. The Chukotkan riverbank in Amguema has borne two world endings in the past century, the end of a world without socialists and the end of the world with them. The story that these endings have etched into this earth bears no relation to Zoroaster's final battle or the pure cleansing fire of Karl's revolution. What the land here speaks instead is a tale in which the rupture is never complete. And perhaps this is because no revolution excises the quotidian, the need to rise and sleep, to nourish and shelter, to care for new birth and imminent deaths. This is the insurmountable stuff of being. In the company of Chukotka's dead and living, I have come to believe that the most terrifying thing about our future is not just what will change or cease or grow uncanny, but what we must continue to do regardless. All of this was visible on the drive to Amguema. Over almost 100 kilometers, the road was marked by sequential clots of debris, by rusted things, broken things, shelters that had been opened to the sky. One way to see this landscape in Chukotka is as unrelentingly scarred, a place befouled by Soviet remnants, an earth that is beyond saving. Another way is as a site of ongoing restitution. The mayor down in the mud, making another year livable in his town, the reindeer rib that Grigory and Anna fed us that afternoon, or the fox that we saw raising her new generation inside a lidless and rusted oil barrel. One thing spending time in Chukotka makes clear is how we all live in the company of the dead, and that we are also all future deaths ourselves, which brings a question: what presents will we be for the lives that come after us? To fix destruction, then, is our task. But what if that mandate summoned not delusions of escape and human grandeur, but repair? It is not an easy task. It will take, I think, everything that I find inspiring in Karl Lux's story, how he worked hard and collectively, how he believed that justice was possible and that equity was critical. Our uneasy world needs his courage and his bodily sacrifice. And both Karl Lux and the Chukchi I have spoken with left me suspicious of a rhetoric that goes alongside the apocalypse, one simply asking for hope, which I have come to think of as a bourgeois feeling of the apocalypse inverted, a privileged claim to a particular emotional state in order to act in times of turmoil. Lux did not write of hope in prison, nor did the Chukchi speak of easy hope in the 1990s, but both spoke of injustice, of the possibility for justice, and of action. And Chukotka's history carries other lessons. It asks that we, particularly those of us privileged enough to be imagining the end of a world for the first time, trade the temptation of apocalyptic escapism for world historical humility. It asks for perseverance without certainty, for prophecies that hold space for more than people. Perhaps most of all, Chukotka is a lesson in how restoring what has broken is a reminder to be careful with what is here now. It is an entreaty to make things last, to create better ruins, and to care for what will outlast our own small, tender lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. We're going to move now to question and answer period, and we'll give people a few minutes to type their questions. And Megan and I might get things started off by asking you a couple of questions ourselves about your talk. So
can I just,
one of the,
can I just say, you can type your question, but you could also raise your hand, and we'd even prefer that. It's a little more human to use your voice to ask your question. So you could press that little raise hand button at the bottom, and we will let you talk to ask a question. Sorry, just a reminder. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, and one of the sad things I think about Zoom, even though it gives us all these opportunities to get together during a pandemic and a climate crisis, is that you miss applause. And so I'm sure had you been here, there would be a round of applause for you, because that was a fantastic talk. There are a couple of things that occurred to me over the course of your talk, and I'm just wondering, I mean, one of the things that kind of I was thinking about was the way in which apocalypse prophecy you're kind of putting out there as a precedent for thinking about our contemporary climate crisis. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that to kind of get the conversation started.
Sure. I wrote this in part out of frustration about a kind of discussion about climate change, but also an understanding of why, or a desire to understand about why narratives of kind of apocalyptic rupture seem to be so attractive, right? I don't think it's because, you know, people are not thinking deeply about this topic. I think it's actually because people are thinking deeply about it that they're reaching for metaphors of incredible rupture and terror, right? Like they're meant to also inspire kind of an emotional or an affective response. But I'd also noticed that they tended to be written by, you know, relatively privileged, usually urban, often male newcomers to the idea of climate change. And that there was something that the most readily graspable narrative for what communities are facing now seemed to be this idea that, you know, the seas were going to come wash us all away. And the imagery gets biblical very quickly. And I have always found myself somewhat uneasy with those narratives. And I think part of why is that I wasn't sure that they were politically particularly advantageous. And they also seem like they were not engaging with the ways in which many communities have dealt with massive ruptures before this one, which is something that Kyle White and many other indigenous theorists have pointed out, right? Worlds have ended before if you're Chukchi, or if you're Lakota, or if you're from any number of native nations across what is now North America. And so I in some ways, this piece was an attempt to think about, like, why do we like to think apocalyptically? What is appealing about it? And what gets left out of those kinds of stories? And I think part of what gets left out is that the apocalypse needs to be unprecedented, and therefore it forecloses on looking back, even if the scale is different than what we are facing now. It prevents a kind of attention to previous substantiations. And I also think it imagines the ending without imagining the actual work of living through it. which, as I hinted, I think has a certain gendered perspective to it, that it's actually a lot less glamorous than Mad Max. It's a lot more like just trying to figure out how to get the laundry done and the kid fed, and those really quotidian things that are actually what keep our lives going.
We have a few questions maybe starting to show up. We have a hand raised. Maybe I'll let a couple more come in and I'll steal my moment to ask you just a question. You know, before we began, you mentioned that when we asked you to give this keynote, you worried at first about, or maybe I'm putting words into your mouth, about it, that you're like, I don't do climate history, right? I'm wondering what kind of histories, this is a really broad one, what kind of histories do you think we need? What kind of other histories do you think we need to confront the climate crisis or climate change? Yeah.
That's a very good question, Megan.
Yeah, it's hard. I know.
And I think in some ways we need lots of kinds of history, right?
Yes.
I don't have like a particular ideological orientation to be like, there's one sort of history and we should all be writing it. And I think that climate history has a lot to say to this, particularly the kind of granular work that people like Dagmar de Groot are doing that actually kind of dig past the big narratives of collapse and look at specific social responses. Like, I think that's really important. I don't personally possess the tools to do it, and so I'm very grateful that other people do. I think for me personally, the kinds of histories that I have been drawn to are ones that look not for necessarily past climate moments, but past moments of analogous or potentially analogous social and ecological disruption, of which there are many, and they look very different in different parts of the world. And I think that diversity of experience is really important, and keeps us from some of those big Jared Diamond, here are the 5 rules of social collapse kind of narratives, and more grounded in what our particular communities are going to encounter. And I also think that as historians, that, you know, our job is to assemble narratives, and narrative is how people understand their world. And so we actually are trained with a tool set that allow us to tell different kinds of stories, right? Stories that I think in their own way are as important as policy things, right? If you can find stories of the ways in which people actually do deal with major upheaval, what works and what doesn't, what that quotidian ends up feeling like and looking like, and where it can be terribly inequitable if we are not careful, and some of those issues that come up over and over in history. I think that's really important as kind of giving people a mental landscape for the places that they will end up living.
I think we'll first take a question from Susan M. Gaines. So I've now selected you to be able to talk, and you should be able to speak now, Susan.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. It's kind of odd. First of all, thank you so much for this beautiful talk. And I don't know if this is a comment that will move us on in thinking about apocalypse, or a question. I was really interested in what you had to say historically about the role that this apocalyptic thinking played in moving thought forward about dealing with crises. But I also really appreciate what you're saying about now, how it's sort of like apocalyptic thinking makes us think that something is inevitable, and so we don't have to do anything about it. And I'm just wondering, so just for some back, I'm a novelist, so I also work with narrative, but I started out my career as a geochemist, so I'm also a scientist, and have been thinking about climate change since the 1980s, basically. And so what I've watched in the literary realm is people picking up this idea of apocalyptic sci-fi stories, and a lot of activists picking it up with the idea that that's what we need. We need to scare people to get things happening. And listening to you now, I'm thinking, okay, well, beyond that, we need to think about we need to think about real life, what's happening and what we can do. So I'm just, I don't know, anyway, I'm just making this analogy between sort of what's going on in literature and what you historians are doing, and thinking about how activists were picking up this concept of the story of the apocalypse to wake people up, because we had this huge sector of our population that wasn't paying attention for decades and decades. So now they're woken up, maybe. And what do we do now? I mean, that's kind of the new stories we need, the new kind of narrative we need, I guess. So anyway, I guess that's more a comment, but I'd love to hear you riff on on those ideas and those novels that are coming out. I wrote a very early climate change novel, but realist, about a scientist, no apocalypse in there. And what came after were all these sort of futuristic, you know, apocalyptic novels, and those are now sort of present tense. Can't do that anymore. Yeah.
Any thoughts, Bathsheba? No.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I love the career trajectory from kind of biochemical sciences to novelist. I have my own questions about that. So I think a couple of things. One of the things that spending a lot of time with dead Bolsheviks has taught me is that while there was this real commitment in and this real strain of kind of apocalyptic thinking of like, we're going to wash away the kind of capitalist detritus from the world and we're going to create something new, is that it was also very much based in material present politics. And I think that that's something that in my probably far more cursory reading of climate fiction, I feel like is starting to emerge, is that climate change, you know, first of all, there was the kind of moment that Amitav Ghosh was writing to where he's like, nobody is talking about this. Like, where is the realist novel? Why is it not grappling with climate change at all? And then there, you know, is the kind of a longer tradition going to Octavia Butler all the way through, you know, N.K. Jemisin of kind of writing science fiction or cli-fi takes that often have this apocalyptic edge to them, partly because they're fun to read. And I think partly also, as you said, is this kind of like way of jolting people out of a kind of complacency. But I think what's difficult about that kind of literature is it's not connected to a political program. And it's really difficult to connect literature to a specific political program, as the Soviets found when they wrote like decades worth of genuinely terrible novels trying to do exactly that, right? If you wed it too much to just a direct pedagogical approach, it gets didactic, and you end up with these terrible things that now no one reads unless they're assigned them in a Soviet history class. And so I think in some ways that the capacity for novels to let people, you know, within their pages dwell in this space of imagining some other kind of world and have it actually be disconnected from material reality is actually kind of great, right? Like it's one of the real gifts of being human, that we can do this, that we can have these flights of imagination. And then I think the next question for communities of concerned people and activists is, how do you take that sudden attention and connect it with something material? And I don't think that the novels have to do all of that. Like shouldering that entire burden in one book might be, you know, it might actually yield a Frankenstein rather than something that's really compelling. But I also think there's, to me, something really interesting happening in books that don't show up as cli-fi, like Jenny Offel's Weather that I mentioned at the beginning, where climate change is absolutely saturated through them, and that it's become unavoidable in a way that I also think has its own kind of politics, right? That novelists are, you know, not writing novels now that can imagine themselves as divorced from this reality, even if they're not imagining a future, they're just kind of understanding it as part of our present. And I think that also, you know, it makes it harder to escape, which probably is politically helpful. But I don't know, those are kind of off the cuff thoughts, but it's a great question.
Thank you so much. The next question comes from our colleague, Joan Neuberger, And Joan, I've just given you the ability to ask your question now on the screen to the panelists, to the panel.
Okay, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, good. Hi, Bathsheba. Thank
Hi,
you so
Joan.
much. Hi, thank you for this really wonderful talk. You've given us such an evocative view of picture of life in Chukotka now, in this sort of not just post-Soviet period, but really 20, 30 years post-Soviet. And I'm wondering if the withdrawal of Soviet industrialization of reindeer herding has resurrected older practices, and if you could talk about that, the impact of that a little bit, and if it's, just what the impact has been on communities as well, of communities of people as well as communities of animals, and also then how it interacts, or what impact maybe there's been of the rise in temperatures. Thanks, and thank you again.
No, thank you, Joan, and thank you for that beautiful write-up. Really, it made me blush. So the contemporary reindeer herding in Chukotka is a really fascinating mashup of pre-Soviet techniques and Soviet techniques and kind of post-Soviet adaptations with both. So one of the things that is kind of a hold from the Soviet period is there's still some use of mechanized transport. There's actually a lot of decommissioned tanks that people use to get kind of between town and reindeer camps. It's the most uncomfortable ride of your life, like bounce around like a bean in a jar, and for hauling heavy goods back and forth. But there is also use of reindeer trained to pull sleds, because reindeer eat off the tundra and you don't have to feed them gas, which is really expensive in the north. So just in terms of transport, there's a kind of a real melding of Soviet tools and traditional ways of using reindeer as draft animals. And the organization of reindeer herding, people still call themselves brigady, like brigades, as set up by the Soviets. And some even use the same numbers, like the brigades were numbered by the collective farms, and they will kind of keep the same numbers going, which is different than the pre-Soviet kind of family organization. But at the same time, even under the Soviets, kind of the family organization sort of trickled along underneath the surface of the brigades. So they're a mix, I would say, and a very adaptive mix. Like keep what worked, throw out what didn't. There's not a lot of pictures of Lenin anymore. That did get thrown out in the wash. And I think most people, what they identify as being the post-Soviet challenge is that they have to deal with the market. And the market for reindeer goods is a capricious master. And so, some years there's more demand than others, and sometimes there's a lot of interest in China, for example, in reindeer horns that you can export, because reindeer drop their horns every year, so you don't even have to, it actually has nothing to do with the reindeer, it's useful for other activities. And then sometimes that market isn't as good, or it's hard to ship them for various reasons. So dealing with the need to sell things as opposed to dealing with the kind of state subsidized system is what people identify as being, that's the hard thing to adapt to in many ways. And the fact that, as you could probably guess from my very brief discussion of reindeer ecology, they are ice age animals, and they're not really fond of the warmer winters that the circumpolar north has been experiencing. So the number of reindeer globally has dropped by about 50% in the last 15 years. And there's, historically a lot of up and down in reindeer populations. And the problem is that we're not seeing the up kind of across the circumpolar world. And that is distressing in Chukotka, and it's distressing anywhere people interact with reindeer or caribou. And it just leaves a great open uncertainty in the future as to how the species will adapt as the world gets warmer. There are some things that kind of at a superficial level seem like they make reindeer life easier. There's a lot more forage in parts of the Arctic because it's warmer, but it's not always what reindeer want to eat. Sometimes it actually makes it harder for them to migrate if there's more shrubbery. It's a really complicated an open question, right? It's one of those things where certainty is really elusive.
Thank you.
Let's see, next up, we have Jesse Rittner, who is another one of our graduate students here and gave his talk in the first session for today on skiing and snowmaking. And if you unmute, you should be able to ask your question, Jesse.
Hi, Dr. Demuth. I loved your talk. It was beautiful, and I don't think I'll ever get bored of listening to you talk and reading your writing. It's really amazing. So you talk about apocalypse, right? And at the end, you sort of have this you called hope a bourgeois narrative as well, which seems like the obvious opposite of apocalypse or despair. And right, so we have apocalypse, which you sort of talk about as this often urban white masculine sort of desire, which makes sense. So, and then hope is bourgeois. So sort of what sits in the middle that we're reaching for, what do we call it? How do we name it? I mean, it feels like there's potentially a lot of things you could talk about, whether it's realism or pragmatism, ambivalence, a sort of pragmatic pessimism. I was just wondering what your thoughts might be.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Jesse. And thank you for your paper this morning. So that my aside about hope comes out of, there's kind of a strain of discussion around climate writing and communication where people are like, and I'm asked this repeatedly, like, what gives you hope? And I don't think that hope is a precondition to action, right? And I think, in fact, if we wait around for hope to be the precondition to action, we're never going to have the darn action. And so I have a lot of kind of pent up frustration about this narrative. And I think some of it comes from teaching and the fact that my undergraduates never ask me about hope. They are concerned, they're angry, they're afraid, they're fired up. Like there's so many emotions that show up in my office hours and in our discussions and in lecture, and none of it is about like, please, professor, tell me why I should be hopeful. And I think that, folks who are in the 18 to 21 range, who are really staring at, the full brunt of what a 2 degrees Celsius plus future looks like, the fact that they are not asking us for hope, they're asking us to do things, should probably be a call to action. And I see the same things when I go back and I read these Bolsheviks who want to create an entirely new world, right? And you can judge the world that they made and how it went awry. But when it actually came down to the business of completely transforming down to the brass tacks an economy and a way of life, they weren't waiting to be hopeful about it. And they sacrificed an enormous amount instead. And I think that that's part of what I look for. And instead, there's this whole bouquet of other emotions, right? Sometimes you're going to be sad about it. Sometimes you're going to be furious. Sometimes you're going to be, fired up because you've actually seen something in your community change, or, somebody's mind has shifted in a way that's important. You've elected a president who seems like can be moved on this issue. There's a whole range of human emotions that I think are great. And I think hope is great. I just don't think we should wait for it. I think we have to make it. And that's my spiel. I also hear a lot of people sort of talking about children as if they're the source of hope. And I really don't think that we should put that burden on the generation that's going to be bearing the brunt of the world that we're giving them, right? They don't want to be our hope. They would really like us to make it better for them. End rant.
Great. Thank you. The next question is from Bethany Wiggin. And Bethany, we made it possible for you to ask the question to Bathsheba.
Thank you so much. That was such a great talk, and I've really enjoyed your book. I also really enjoyed your rant about hope, so keep ranting. That works for me. Many of the sort of concerns that you're hearing from your undergraduates are very similar to those that I hear as well. I wanted to ask, though, a question about the kinds of futurisms that you might be drawing on as you are thinking towards strategies of repair and creating better ruins. I think, your critique of apocalyptic thinking is absolutely trenchant and resonates greatly with my own concerns. You've alluded several times to a feminist ethics of care. You mentioned N.K. Jemisin and Octavia Butler, and I'm just sort of wondering, like, maybe if it's not a kind of naive sense of hope that we're drawing on, what are the futurist traditions, futurist thinkers that we can draw on for sources of inspiration, and not just thinkers, but also doers, like practices of repair and care that you would point toward?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Bethany. I think some folks that I have found helpful to think with and that I have taught and seen be helpful for others include people like Octavia Butler and N.K. Jemisin, who I teach pretty regularly. And I think, Butler has a really unsparing diagnosis of, the perils of trying to recreate anything in a sort of crumbling, racialized capitalist California that she described in, 1993, and now looks like the world we live in to an eerie degree. But she also, I think, very aptly identifies the ways in which community is critical, and to make a community, you need a kind of shared narrative, and a narrative that builds in an ethics of relationship, right? And so the kind of idea of Earthseed that runs through that novel, it's not hopeful in a trite sense, but it certainly is about having faith and the capacity to act collectively toward a goal because of a sort of shared set of principles. And she's very unsparing about how hard it is to do that in ways that I think are actually really helpful, right? And there's a reason that Butler's work has actually been kind of used and applied outside of just the joy of reading her novels as a kind of signpost for how do you make collective action possible. I also really like teaching with Indigenous visions of futurism. Sometimes I use Rebecca Roanhorse's novels, but it's a really rich landscape of authors who are kind of looking at a moment when the kind of American settler colonial state might actually be vulnerable to true kind of rupture and transformation, and that as opposed to that looking like a sort of negative apocalypse, it's actually full of promise, right? Is this actually a moment when you can reorient social and political life around a set of principles that Indigenous cultures around the Americas have kind of managed to shelter through the last 500 years of colonization, kept into the present, and have the capacity to kind of flourish in the future. And my undergrads have found those to be, I have to be really compelling visions of these are political practices that existed and worked in the past, have been maintained in communities, throughout this history, and therefore kind of exist, not in a way to save us, because they require, Karl Lux world historical transformation, but that are kind of a vocabulary of political options. And I think more kind of specifically and less in the realm of narrative, I have been really kind of humbled and impressed by students that I've worked with here at Brown who are organizers in the Sunrise Movement. I didn't think that you could start trying to push the kind of national level discourse within the United States around climate legislation from where they started in late 2017 and into the 2018 midterms. And push it as far as they have, right? It has, what the Biden administration announced yesterday as a set of climate change goals comes from, those college kids getting arrested in Nancy Pelosi's office in 2018 in a way that's actually really tangible. And you can just connect the line and it's like an accessible kind of model of organizing and activity that that's like right there, and is doing things in the present.
Sorry. Next up, we have Naomi Oreskes, who is actually our closing keynote speaker. So Naomi, I'm sorry. I've just accidentally, give me 1 second.
Why don't we let Angelo ask his question?
Oh, okay.
We're going to go to him next, and then we'll end with Naomi Oreskes as a sort of, how does that sound? Maybe one or two other questions.
We can just, sorry, we're gonna, let's stick with Naomi first, and then we'll,
okay.
I will put Angelo, you're up next. Sorry for the mistake there.
Oh, sorry.
Naomi, you're on.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
First of all, again, I want to thank you for a really terrific talk that was both empirically and conceptually rich. And I actually think we'll create a great bookend with my talk tomorrow. So really happy to be in conversation with you and everyone here, and also for the great graduate student talks this morning. And I was so dedicated that I was up at 6:30 a.m. in Pacific time. Yes. So I have a kind of a comment and a question. I want to pick up again on this hope theme, because I think it's really, really important. And I've been grappling with trying to understand it as well, because I also get that question all the time, exactly the way you put it. What gives you hope? And it drives me nuts. And I've been trying to understand why it drives me so nuts. And I think you've just put the finger on it. So thank you for that, because it's a really passive kind of question, right? It implies that you're sitting by the fireplace or by the radio listening to the fireside chat, having hope, when what we're really thinking about is action and how to be active. And I think this is something I'm going to talk about tomorrow, but this is a tricky thing for us as historians too, because we haven't really been trained to think about our work in terms of stimulating action. But I think that is part of the challenge that we face as what I like to think of as being a scholar activist. I think it's also, just again to underscore what you said about work, that there's a lot of work to be done here, and hope seems to be implying that we're hoping for someone else to come and solve the problem for us. I keep thinking about the cargo cult, right? That someone else will arrive with the goods, we just have to cheer, right? And you see this, I think I've seen this a lot in climate scientists who got so excited, they got their hopes up literally, when the Pope issued his encyclical, as if somehow that would change everything. Or Greta Thunberg, that somehow she was the hero, she was the Gandhi of climate change. And in a way, it is a resistance to actually taking on board the deep questions that I think your work raises about changes that we have to make, not just in what we do, but in how we think. And again, I think that's where as historians, we can really have an intervention to think about how what we do engages with the question of how people think. Just one other thing I wanted to share, because it's just too funny not to share, and then I do have a genuine question. So on Twitter, I don't know if you guys can see me, but on Twitter, Nathaniel Stinnett, who does a lot of work, he's of the Environmental Voter Project, does a tremendous amount of great work, tweeted this morning, Dunkin' Donuts is selling avocado toast, and that's gotta be a sign of the apocalypse. I thought you would appreciate that. So maybe it's what you said, that we're attracted to the apocalypse, not as an ending, but as a rupture, as the idea that we can wipe this slate clean. I mean, if Dunkin' Donuts can sell, healthy food, and if it's really vegan, then, maybe there is hope, right? Okay, and then quickly to my question. I wanted to ask you what you thought about Roy Scranton's work, and particularly his book, Learning to Die in the Anthropocene, because that could be viewed as apocalyptic in some ways, but it could also be viewed as not apocalyptic. And I just was curious if you wanted to comment on his work. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Naomi. And thank you in general for being, I think, a tricky thing if you are a newer professional historian, is figuring out how to have a role that has a kind of an activist component, because it's not a discipline like, some other disciplines have a strong, long tradition of this. And I think it's a little newer in history. And you are certainly one of the people who I think of as actually giving us some real guidance on how to do that in important and graceful ways. So thank you. And I love the idea of avocado toast at Dunkin' Donuts. That's wonderful. I really like many aspects of Roy Scranton's work. And I do think, you can read it as apocalyptic, but I think that what I appreciate in it is his really frank desire to discuss the hesitancy in many Western cultures to confront just the fact of death and dying. And that, unlike apocalyptic thinking, that it is often about eternal salvation, right? And living forever, that he's actually talking about the opposite in a really granular way, about like learning how to deal with the fact that we are mortal, and not trying to avoid mortality through kind of economic means or narrative strategies. So I really think that was an important, I think that's something really important in his work, and a reason that I assign it.
Great, thank you so much. I think I'm going to chime in here now on the issue of hope, on the topic of hope, as the coordinator of the Radical Hope syllabus, which is
but it's the radical part. The radical part is important.
People have seen this, or if you're familiar with it, but it was a project that came out of a conference that John Barry and I did through the Rachel Carson Center in 2018, and it has since had a life of its own. So it's a crowdsourced syllabus on climate change where people are really grappling, historians, scholars, engineers, everybody, with how do you sort of in a moment of despair, what kinds of scholarship do we produce that is actionable, or what kind of lessons from the past can we provide to our students that actually provides a sort of blueprint for action moving forward? So solving, learning, etc. So it really is a design that is molded around the action part that people are talking about. So I think there are many different discourses of hope and around hope. And I understand the one that you guys are talking about, because I get that question asked a lot too, as somebody who works on water in the Southwest, the passive part, right, about that. But there is a kind of active engagement with it, which I think is also valuable. So I just thought I would sort of chime in because it was taking on a, it seemed relevant to something that I have worked on a lot. And everybody is willing, it's a crowdsourced syllabus. So if you want to have a unit on despair or passive hope or anything, please feel free, and this is to everybody, to send it to us and we'll get it up on the crowdsourced syllabus. So it's been used in 72 different countries. So lots of people are using the syllabus. Okay, so our next question is going to come from Angelo. So Angelo, we are bringing you on so you can ask your question.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you so much to organizers for putting together such a wonderful conference. And also it's always a pleasure to learn about Bathsheba's work and listen to her wonderful talk. So I just have a question about the perception of climate change in Russia that you gestured towards the end, especially when you're referring to the community you worked in particular along the Bering Strait. And I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit. And in particular, if these apocalyptic narratives that are so common in the West, I was wondering if they exist also in Russia. There was a very provocative article in the New York Times recently that ran this series of articles on climate migration. It was a 3-parts set of articles. And the last one was titled "How Russia Wins the Climate Crisis," where pretty much the argument was that the warming of the planet in the future will actually benefit the exploitation of Siberia. Of course, it's a very narrow, kind of short-sighted view in terms of, in the long term, everybody will lose the climate crisis. But it is true that the current government in Russia, a lot of its revenues come from this export of fossil fuels. So I was wondering if, yes, what are the views on climate change in Russia, if there is this apocalyptic component, if there is also a sort of protest, anti-government kind of role that narratives of climate change have. Thank you so much again.
thank you, Angelo, and it's good to hear from you. We went to grad school together. So, and I really didn't mean to sort of cast dispersion on all forms of hope. It's mostly that formulation of giving, I think. Radical hope is very different than like asking to be bequeathed something. So the question about climate change in Russia is it's a great one, and it's very regionally specific, and it's not particularly heterodox. And this gives me a chance to refute that New York Times piece, which I thought was terribly executed from top to bottom. In Chukotka itself, there's just an enormous amount of on-the-ground concern about what climate change is doing to people's daily lives because of the reindeer, because of erosion, because of just kind of the practicalities of living with thawing permafrost, which is destroying a lot of infrastructure, as it's doing all over the Soviet North. And there's concern that the government is not particularly tuned into those issues. And they're not tuned in because Russia at the moment it's a full-on petro state. The majority of the state coffers come from selling natural gas and petroleum, and it's not an easy off-ramp from that once you're engaged. And I think it's led to some of the really kind of confusing and contradictory statements that have come out at the federal level in Russia, where on the one hand, about a year and a half ago, there was a really kind of very clear-eyed, bleak report about what climate change was doing to particularly northern parts of Russia and to the agrarian belt in the south. And then also this kind of triumphalist, if you were paying attention to sort of the Russian internet a couple of weeks ago when that ship was blocking the Suez Canal, Russia was having an amazing time advertising the northern sea route as an alternative shipping lane because the sea ice has retreated so much in the Arctic Ocean that it's very soon to be an alternative to sending ships through the Suez. So there's kind of, they're dancing two different jigs with two different feet, as many countries are, right? This is not an unusual case. The United States does this, pretty much everywhere else is doing it, actually. But because Russia is a petrostate, they're really kind of grappling with an economic issue. The thing that I feel like the New York Times just neglected to discuss at all. I think it was great that they're talking about climate migrants. I think it's important to talk about the fact that in the Russian Far East, this is one of the many things that is creating movement across borders. That movement, however, is very long-standing. It goes back to the Soviet period. Russia has always had a problem peopling its periphery. Plans to kind of borrow population from China and Korea are long-standing. They're, I think, increasing because of climate, but they're not necessarily caused by it. And secondly, that article did not talk at all about something that within Russia is discussed frequently, which is real concern over agricultural collapse. That the steppe region is becoming drier in ways that they can't irrigate themselves out of, and there are serious food security concerns within Russia. And I thought it was actually irresponsible of the New York Times to make it look like a shipping route is going to compensate for this. And thawing permafrost does not give you farmable soil. It gives you piles of uncomposted muck. It's not like they can just move agriculture north. And people in Russia know this. They're very sophisticated soil scientists in Russia, and the Kremlin knows this, right? So I don't think it's quite as I think at the moment it's tied up with the fact that Putin would like to remain in power for a long time, and to remain in power, he needs money in the short term. And the only way to get money in the short term is by selling fossil fuels, which puts Russia in the position of many states where the short-term political expediencies are running into the long-term necessities. I feel like I'm ranting a lot. I need like a non-ranty question.
No, I don't mind. I don't mind it. We have time for one final question, if you don't mind, and that's from one of our IHS fellows this year, Christopher Sellers. So please go ahead and have the final question, Chris.
Oh, wow. Final question. Well, for a great talk, eloquent and penetrating. I'm really pleased to make your acquaintance, Bathsheba. And and to
Thank
hear
you.
about your work. As you spoke, I had this whole comparative set of questions opening up. You're focused on Soviet industrialization. You sort of invoke the Marxist ideology as a sort of driving force in liberation and so on. But that raised a lot of questions for me about what's going on in parallel or differently in more capitalist regimes over the Arctic, Canada, Finland, the US. And I'm sure you thought about that, but could you just sketch out how you see the Soviet case as either it's more similar or different to those cases in terms of the historical trajectories and the impacts?
Well, thank you, Chris, for asking a question that not only I don't have to rant through, but also one that I can genuinely answer. It's lovely to meet you on here. The book that this talk is a bit of a spin-off from is a comparative history. So it looks at both sides of the Bering Strait in contrast with each other. So I also have the kind of capitalist mirror to this socialist experiment in mind. During the kind of the heyday of the Soviet Union, in many particulars, the Soviets and the Americans end up making really similar choices about how to try and extract resources from the far north. Just the kind of daily particulars often look very similar to each other. There are some, I think, really revealing and interesting differences, however, one of which is that the Soviet Union, because of this deep commitment that people like Karl Lux had to creating equity, and this was not a buzzword. This was like the reason for the state to exist, was to make people equal, meant that the levels of investment and dedication to kind of creating infrastructure in the north in the Soviet Union was far greater than in the United States, where the US government in Alaska often kind of follows what the market is doing. So, if there's a gold rush, the state arrives in order to settle mining claims and to police things, and then eventually to deal with infrastructure. Certainly the state is deeply involved in oil exploration in Prudhoe Bay, in kind of settling indigenous land claims and kind of making that exploitation possible and coordinating the Alaska pipeline. But that's a tiny part of Alaska. Much of Alaska never gets touched by these resource busts and booms, and as a result have just far less kind of attention from either kind of capitalist forms of development, just market-driven things, or from state intervention. Whereas in the Russian Arctic, there's just a lot more kind of building and presence and infrastructure, and that lasts into the present. In some ways, it's, if I was to break my arm in Chukotka, it would be much easier to access medical care than if I broke my arm on the American side, because every community has a clinic. And some of those expectations that were set up during the Soviet period, that every community would have a clinic, that there would be subsidized food, that no one will turn your heat off if you can't pay the heat bill. Those things have outlasted the Soviet Union because they become simply just part of how you run a society. Whereas on the Alaskan side, it's very possible to go hungry. It's very possible to have your heat shut off, and it can be really hard to get medical care. And so I think some of that infrastructure has this long tail. The inverse of that is that political organizing, particularly around environmental issues and indigenous rights, has much more space to grow and flourish in the United States and Canada. And I don't want to, let either the United States or Canada off the hook, because it's not like they're great, particularly when it comes to recognizing indigenous sovereignty. But it's not a place where it's openly dangerous to the extent that it can be in the Russian Federation to protest the state. And there are actual spaces of indigenous sovereignty within the United States and Canada, and Russia really doesn't recognize land title in the same way. So in that sense, it's a very different picture. Yeah, I think I will.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was really wonderful. And it's a good place to kind of end today's opening keynote. You've really set us up for to discuss a lot of different issues that will come up in some of the other papers as we move forward. So I'm really looking forward to additional conversation. And just to give everybody a heads up about the schedule, the next panel will begin at 3 o'clock, which is historicizing climate change. And we have four great papers, Clark Alejandrino, Jorge Canizares Esquera, Melissa Churenko, and Deborah Cohen from Yale University. So we'll continue the discussion at 3. So we hope to see everybody back, take a break, stretch, take a little walk.
Go outside for Earth Day.
Yeah, go outside for Earth Day. But thank you so much, and a hearty round of applause for your talk and for you're being so gracious to answer all those questions.
It set a perfect foundation for the rest of the day today and tomorrow.
Okay. Yeah, well, thank you so much for the invitation and for the wonderful questions. And it was good to meet all of you. It's the only way I meet people.
One day in person.
Yes, and I'm looking forward to the session this afternoon. So
great. I'll see you then.
All right. Bye.